The dress still smelled like river water the morning she stepped off the ferry at Oregon City. It was the 14th of October, 1859, and the Willamette was running low and cold and the color of old pewter, and she stood at the edge of the dock with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes moving across the faces of the men assembled there, until she found the one holding a yellow wildflower. He was taller than she had expected. The letters had not mentioned his height. They had mentioned his hands, that he had good hands, square and careful, the hands of a man who builds things to last. And she saw those hands now, one of them turning the stem of that wildflower slowly, the way a man turns the brim of his hat when he is trying not to show that he is nervous. His name was James Aldrich. He had come from Kentucky to claim 160 acres in the Willamette Valley, and he had built the house before he had written the first letter, which she had always thought said something about him. He had wanted to offer something real before he asked for anything in return. That was what Clara had said. That was the part Clara had loved best. Ruth Calloway had read those letters so many times over the last 5 months that she knew them the way she knew the Lord's Prayer. Not by thinking, but by feel, the words rising on their own when she least expected them. She had read them in the wagon, in the dark, with Clara's head in her lap and the sound of the river rushing somewhere too close. She had read them aloud when Clara could no longer hold them herself. She had read the last one, the one that had arrived the morning they left Independence, Missouri, standing over a fresh grave at the edge of the Snake River while the wagon train moved on without her. And then she had made a decision. She wanted you to know that it did not feel like theft. She wanted that recorded somewhere, even if only here, even if only now. Standing on that dock with river mud still caked along the hem of the green dress, watching a man with a wildflower search the faces of the women coming off the ferry, it had not felt like theft. It had felt like the only direction left on the compass. Ruth had not come west looking for love. She had come west looking for distance. That is the honest thing to say, and she would say it later, in the letter she eventually wrote to her sister back in Chillicothe, Ohio, the one she never sent. That was found tucked inside the back cover of her Bible when she died, 41 years after that October morning on the dock. She had needed to put as many miles as the continent would allow between herself and a man named Harold Calloway, who had been her husband for 6 years and her punishment for longer than that. Harold had developed, somewhere in his 4th decade of living, a habit of expressing his disappointments with his fists. He had many disappointments. She had left on a Tuesday in March with a trunk, a second dress, and $23 sewn into the hem of that dress by a neighbor woman named Mrs. Farwell, who had seen the bruises and said nothing about them except, "The wagon trains leave from Independence in May. Go before the mud dries." She had arrived in Independence the 2nd week of April with no plan beyond the 1st mile and no one she knew within 500 miles in any direction. Clara Hastings had found her on her 3rd day in town. Or perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps Ruth had found Clara, sitting alone on a wooden crate outside the provisioners, a leather satchel on her knee and a letter in her hand, reading it for what looked like at least the 3rd time. She was 24 years old, which was 4 years younger than Ruth, and she had the kind of face that people called kind before they called it pretty. Wide-set dark eyes, a mouth that curved easily toward smiling even when there was nothing particular to smile about. She was from Cincinnati. Her mother had died the previous winter. Her father had remarried a woman who had made it clear, without ever saying so directly, that Clara's continued presence in the house was a temporary courtesy. The letter in her hand was from a man named James Aldrich in Oregon City, Oregon. She had answered an advertisement. She would say this plainly, without embarrassment, because there was no shame in it. A woman alone in 1859 needed practical solutions, and this was a practical solution that also happened to involve a man who wrote with something that felt, when she read his words, like real honesty. 7 months of letters. 2 months ago, an agreement to come west. Ruth sat down beside her on the crate without being invited. Clara did not seem to mind. By the morning of May 3rd, when the wagon train captain called the muster at the edge of Independence, they had arranged to share a wagon. The 1st month was hardest in the body. The second month was hardest in the mind. The trail out of Missouri crossed the Kansas prairie and then bent northwest toward the Platte River. And the Platte was wide and shallow and the color of weak coffee, and it went on for so long that some days Ruth felt they were not moving at all, only standing still while the same flat land scrolled past them like wallpaper. The oxen plodded. The wagon wheels found every rock. The sun was relentless on the open plain, and by the time they reached Fort Laramie in the middle of June, Ruth's hands had cracked at the knuckles and her lips had split and healed and split again, and she had stopped expecting the next day to be easier. But by Fort Laramie she also knew Clara. Really knew her. The way you know someone after 6 weeks of eating beside them and sleeping 12 inches away and sharing water from the same canteen and watching how they behave when things go badly. Clara was afraid of thunderstorms and not afraid of anything else Ruth could identify. She could recite from memory every president, every state capital, and the complete text of The Raven, which she had performed one night at the campfire with such unwavering conviction that 3 men from adjacent wagons had stopped their own conversations to listen. She had a stubbornness about her that she wore quietly, the way some women wear their best jewelry, only on certain occasions but unmistakable when it appeared. And she was sick. She had not announced this. It was something Ruth had noticed. The cough worse in the mornings, the way she sometimes paused in the middle of a sentence and went still, waiting for something to pass through her. One evening, washing plates in a creek south of Chimney Rock, Clara had used the word quietly without looking up. Consumption. Don't, Ruth had said. I'm not asking for sympathy. Clara dried her hands on her apron. I thought you should know. In case something happens. Nothing is going to happen. Clara had looked at her with that patient expression she had sometimes, the one that said she was allowing Ruth to say something untrue because Ruth needed to say it. James knows, she said. I told him before I agreed to come. I thought it was only fair. What did he say? A small smile. He said he'd built the house with good ventilation. He said the Oregon air was known to be healing. She paused. I think he was being kind, but I also think he meant it. I think that's the sort of man he is. They reached the Snake River on the last day of July. It had been a dry summer and the crossing was rougher than the captain had expected. The water running fast and shallow in all the wrong places, unpredictable and brown with sediment, and the animals were nervous in the way that animals are nervous when they sense something the humans haven't yet reasoned out. Clara had been worse for 2 weeks. The dust of the Snake River plain had settled into her lungs like something with intentions, and she had stopped trying to hide the coughing, and Ruth had started sleeping beside her in the wagon instead of underneath it so she would hear if something changed in the night. They were midway through the crossing on a Tuesday morning when the 4th wagon in the train caught a current it wasn't prepared for. The men shouted. The captain shouted. 2 oxen went down on the slick rock bottom and the whole train ground to a stop in the middle of moving water. And in the commotion Ruth's attention was pulled downstream for just a moment, a single moment. And when she turned back, Clara was not where she had been. The water was cold enough to stop the breath. Even at the end of July the Snake runs cold. They found her 30 yards downstream, caught against a shelf of rock, alive but barely, and they pulled her out and Ruth wrapped her in every dry thing she could reach and built a fire on the bank that was more hope than heat and held Clara through that night and the next night and the night after that, while the wagon train camped and the captain argued with the men in low voices about how long they could wait. Clara died on a Friday morning, just before dawn, with her hand in Ruth's and her breathing so quiet at the end that Ruth almost missed the moment it stopped. She sat with her for a long time. Then she got up, because there was nothing else to do, and she began to dig. The wagon train captain came to her that afternoon while she was still patting the dirt flat over the mound. His name was Goss. He was a practical man in the way that men who lead wagon trains through 2,000 miles of continent have to be practical. And he told her, not unkindly, that they would be moving out the following morning, and that if she intended to continue west, she would need to make arrangements. She listened with her hands still on the shovel and her eyes on the dark earth, and something happening inside her chest that she did not try to name. She was a widow with $23 and no destination. She was not afraid of dying on this trail. She was afraid of surviving it. of arriving at the end of 2,000 miles with nothing in front of her and nowhere behind her worth returning to. Clara's trunk was in the wagon. She sat with it a long time before she opened it. The green dress was packed in muslin, the way Clara had kept it, saving it for the arrival. The letters were tied with twine and laid along the side. A small locket with a photograph of Clara's mother. A piece of paper in Clara's careful handwriting. James Aldridge. Oregon City, Oregon. Willamette Valley. Ruth spread it all around her in the dim interior of the wagon and sat with it. She thought about Clara saying, "I think that's the sort of man he is." She thought about a house built with good ventilation. About square, careful hands. About a man who had written 40 letters before asking for anything. She thought about Harold Calloway, who was somewhere behind her now, growing smaller with every mile. She set the locket aside. That felt like too much. That belonged to Clara in a way she couldn't take. But the dress, the name, the address on that piece of paper, she did not tell herself it was right. She told herself it was the only remaining direction. In the morning, when Captain Ghost called the muster, she answered to Clara Hastings. No one questioned it. No one had known either of them well enough to question it. That was one of the strange mercies of a wagon train, that a person could become, in the space of a single night, someone slightly different from who they had been. Everyone out here was becoming someone slightly different. That was half the reason they had come. The remaining weeks were the loneliest she had ever known. And she had known considerable loneliness. She wore the green dress only on Sundays. The rest of the time she kept it folded in the muslin, because she was not certain she had earned the right to wear it every day. She read the letters in order, first to last, sitting with them at the campfire after the others had gone to sleep, the fire burning down to coals and a smell of sage thick in the high desert air. She learned James Aldridge the way a student learns a difficult language, carefully, slowly, trying to understand not just what the words said but what they meant underneath. He had come to Oregon from Kentucky at 28. He had lost his first wife to fever 2 winters after their arrival. The land claim had been her dream originally. He had stayed because leaving felt like abandoning her a second time. He had written this in the 3rd letter without trying to make it sound better than it was, and Ruth had read that paragraph 4 times somewhere east of Fort Boise, and then she had folded the letter and put it away and sat for a long time with her hands in her lap. Clara was right about him. That was when the fear had started in earnest. Not the fear of being discovered, though that was always there, a low hum beneath everything else, a sound like bees in the walls of a house, but the fear of something worse. She was going to meet a man she had no right to meet. She was going to step into a life that had not been made for her body or her name, and some part of her, the part she trusted least, was going to want to stay in it. She wrote nothing during those weeks. She had nothing she was willing to have found. Oregon City was gray and green and smelled of pine and wet earth and the river, and she stood on the ferry as it crossed the Willamette and watched the dock come closer, until she could make out the faces of the people waiting there. He was the one with the wildflower. She would think about that wildflower for years. Not a cultivated thing, not something from a shop, a wildflower, slightly wilted, the kind a man picks along a path and carries not because it is impressive, but because it felt right. She imagined him stopping to pick it, turning it over in his hand, deciding it was worth carrying. Something inside her moved in a direction she had not authorized. She walked toward him across the dock. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "Miss Hastings." And then, very quietly, almost to himself, "You made it. Not welcome, or you're here, or any of the things she had prepared for. Just, you made it." As if he understood, more than she had known, what it had cost to arrive. She did not cry. She had not cried since the morning she put Clara in the ground, and she was not going to start now on a public dock in front of a man she had no right to stand in front of. But it was closer than she had been in 2 months. He had arranged for her to stay with a Mrs. Connolly in town while the necessary arrangements were made, and she had said this was proper and careful of him, and he had looked slightly embarrassed and said he hadn't known what else to do. They ate dinner twice that first week at Mrs. Connolly's table, and James was exactly what the letters had suggested. Steady, deliberate, a man who chose his words as if they cost something, and intended to get his money's worth out of every one. She told him that she had enjoyed the letters. He said he was glad, and that he had found them harder to write than anything he had done since building the first wall of the house in January wind with his hands going numb. She laughed. She had not laughed in 2 months. He looked at her when she laughed. A quick glance, unguarded, and then he looked away. And she thought, "This is the most dangerous thing that has ever happened to me." She had survived Harold Calloway. She had survived 2,000 miles of this continent. She had buried her only friend in the shadow of the Snake River and walked away wearing her dress and carrying her name. None of it had frightened her the way this frightened her. The danger arrived on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the ferry. A man named Garrison, who had been in the wagon train, came into town for supplies. She saw him first. She was crossing the main street toward the provisioners, and she recognized him a half-second before he could have recognized her, and she had exactly 3 seconds to make a decision. She turned down a side street and walked quickly, not running, and did not stop until she was behind Mrs. Connolly's house with her back flat against the wood siding and her breathing unsteady. She stayed inside for 2 days with a headache she did not have. Mrs. Connolly brought broth and did not ask questions, which was the kind of woman she was. On the 3rd morning, she watched from the window as Garrison's wagon left town heading north, and she stood there until she could not see it anymore. She understood then that she could not do this indefinitely. She was not built for it. Every day she waited was another day she was taking something from James Aldridge that he had not agreed to give. He had agreed to marry Clara Hastings of Cincinnati, a woman who was kind before she was pretty and who could recite The Raven by heart and who had died on a Friday morning with her hand held and her breathing gone quiet. James Aldridge did not know that woman was gone. He did not know that the woman sitting at his dinner table was Ruth Calloway, widow, Chillicothe, Ohio, who had run from a bad man and borrowed a dead friend's name because it was the only direction the compass had left. He deserved to know. The question was what he would do when he did. She asked him to walk with her on a Sunday afternoon, 2 days after Garrison's wagon had disappeared. They went along the Willamette, which was quiet in October, carrying its own deep business without making noise about it, and she waited until they were far enough from town that she felt she could speak without anyone overhearing. Then she told him everything. Ruth Calloway. Harold Calloway. $23 in a hem. Independence, Missouri, and a woman sitting on a crate reading his letters. 6 weeks of trail and a friendship that had grown in the way that friendships on the trail grew, fast and necessary, the way a plant grows fast when it doesn't have much time. Consumption, the Snake River, a Friday morning and a grave and a shovel and a green dress in a trunk. She did not tell it well. She had rehearsed it, and rehearsal had not helped. She stumbled. She repeated herself. She said the word sorry so many times it lost its shape. He listened without interrupting once. He did not look away, and he did not let his face go closed and flat, which was what she had feared most. That specific blankness, the one she had learned to dread over 6 years in a house in Chillicothe. When she finished, they stood in silence with the river moving past and the smell of pine coming down from the hills, and neither of them knowing what came next. He said, "She wrote me about you." Ruth looked at him. "In one of her letters. June, I think. She said she'd found a woman at Independence who needed a direction, and she'd given her one." He stopped, cleared his throat. "She said she hoped I wouldn't mind that she'd made a friend." The thing that had been sealed inside Ruth's chest since August came loose all at once, and she pressed her hand flat against her sternum as if she could hold it in place. "She wrote about you quite a lot after that," James said. He was looking at the river. "She said you were the bravest person she had met on the trail." A pause. "She had some things she hoped for. I won't tell you all of them. Those are hers." The river went on past them. "I don't know what to do with this," Ruth said finally, because it was the most honest sentence she could find. "Neither do I," he said. "Not yet." He looked at her then, directly, the way he did when he meant what he said. "But I'd like a little time to figure it out. If you're willing to wait." She was. She stayed at Mrs. Connolly's through October. He came for dinner twice, and they did not mention what had passed between them at the river, and they talked about the farm and about Kentucky and about a book he had been reading, and it was strange and quiet and nothing like what she had imagined in any direction. On the 1st of November, a Tuesday, he knocked at Mrs. Connolly's door in the early evening and asked if she would come and see the farm. The house was exactly what the letters had described: square and careful, built to last, with 2 rocking chairs on the front porch facing west toward where the sun went down behind the hills. She stood in the doorway and looked at those 2 chairs and thought about a woman she had never seen sit in one. James stood beside her. She would have liked it, Ruth said. She did not know if it was true. She hoped it was. I think so too, he said. They stood there until the light was completely gone. She never called herself Clara again after that afternoon at the river. That name went back to the woman it had always belonged to. What came after? The slow and careful and entirely unglamorous work of 2 people deciding whether to trust each other. She would describe in the unsent letter to her sister as something she did not have a good word for. Not love, not yet. Something before love. Something that had to be chosen every morning, the way you choose to get up and face the cold and start the fire. She wrote, near the end of that letter, "I think that is the sort of thing it is. I think it asks you to stay and find out." She stayed. She found out.